They had been taught that Americans were monsters, but the first thing the monsters did was hand them hamburgers. The heat of the Arizona desert shimmered like a mirage, bending the air between wire fences and wooden watchtowers. Behind those fences stood hundreds of exhausted men in tattered khaki uniforms, their eyes hollow, their pride buried beneath the weight of defeat. They were Japanese soldiers, men who had once sworn to die before surrender. Now they were prisoners of the very enemy they had been raised to hate. They had been captured in the Pacific, Saipan, Guam, and Iwo Jima, islands that once burned with the cries of dying men. When the war swept them away like a storm, they expected death, not mercy. They were prepared to be executed, starved, or paraded like animals. But instead, they were sent here, a U.S. prisoner of war camp so quiet, so surreal, that some of them wondered if it was a trick. At sunrise, they stood in line for what they assumed would be their last humiliation, breakfast served by their captors. And then something unexpected happened. The guards, young American soldiers in crisp uniforms, chewing gum and laughing, began handing them food. Not rations, not dried fish, not rice, but something unfamiliar and fragrant. The smell floated through the air like an insult and a miracle all at once. Burgers, one American said, placing a bun in the shaking hands of Sergeant Hiroshi Sato. And Coke. You guys ever had one? Sato didn't answer. He couldn't. In his mind, America had been a demon nation. He had been told Americans drank blood and slaughtered prisoners. Yet here was one of them, a boy barely 20, offering him food with a casual grin. He looked down at the thing in his hand, a soft round bread, glistening with grease, a slice of red tomato, a leaf of green lettuce, and between them, a piece of meat so thick and juicy it almost looked unreal. The Coca-Cola bottle hissed as the cap came off. The sound startled the Japanese soldiers. Some even flinched, mistaking it for gunfire. But the American laughed. "Relax, buddy," he said. "It's just soda." The prisoners exchanged uneasy glances. Some refused to touch the food. Others sniffed it suspiciously, like animals testing bait. A few turned away in disgust, muttering prayers for purity. But hunger has a way of breaking pride. After months of starvation, rice infested with maggots, and water so foul it smelled like metal, the scent of cooked beef and bread was unbearable. Sato hesitated for a long moment, then took a bite, and that's when it happened. He froze, then trembled, then his eyes that had seen comrades blown apart, villages burn, and oceans turn red, began to water. The other POWs watched as he chewed slowly, as though trying to remember how to eat. Then before anyone could speak, tears slid down his dirt-streaked face. Not the tears of weakness, but something more complicated. Gratitude, shame, relief. He didn't know. The Americans watched silently. Even they seemed confused. "You okay, pal?" one asked softly. Sato swallowed, nodded, then bowed slightly. "Arigato," he whispered. The others began to eat, and soon the camp filled with the strangest sound. Men crying quietly as they tasted hamburgers and Coca-Cola for the first time in their lives. For the U.S. guards, it was just breakfast. For the prisoners, it was something unthinkable. How could the enemy, the same men who dropped fire on Hiroshima and Tokyo, feed them like human beings? Was this kindness or psychological warfare? Later that day, as the desert sun turned the sky gold, Captain Raymond Ellis, commander of Camp Florence, stood in his office watching the men through the blinds. He was a veteran of Guadalcanal, a man who had lost half his platoon to Japanese gunfire. And yet, when he saw the prisoners sitting quietly, eating and drinking like lost souls rediscovering life, he felt something stir inside him. "Funny, ain't it?" said his sergeant walking in. "They look like kids seeing ice cream for the first time." Ellis nodded slowly. "Maybe they are." He turned away from the window, rubbing the scar on his jaw, a souvenir from a bayonet fight. "You know what I can't figure out, Joe?" he said. "We fought them to the death, and now they're here, crying over a sandwich. Makes you wonder, what were we all really fighting for?" That night, the camp grew quiet. The desert wind whispered across the barracks. Some of the POWs prayed. Others stared at the stars through the wire, remembering their families, their emperor, their homes that no longer existed. Sato lay on his cot, clutching the empty Coke bottle like a relic. It was cold and smooth, marked with English letters he couldn't read. He thought of the propaganda he had heard before the war, that American culture was corrupt, shallow, godless. But that drink, it had tasted like something else, like freedom, like peace. He turned to his bunkmate, Private Kenta Yamazaki, who lay awake beside him. Kenta, Sato whispered, do you think this is mercy or mockery? I don't know, Kenta murmured, but if this is the enemy, I think I've been lied to my whole life. Days turned into weeks. The camp routines continued. Roll call, work duty, language lessons, and meals that seemed far too generous for prisoners. The Americans played baseball. Sometimes the POWs watched, their faces half curious, half haunted. A few even began to join, timidly at first, then with laughter that shocked even themselves. But not everyone accepted this strange peace. Lieutenant Kenji Mori, once a proud imperial officer, refused to eat American food. He starved himself slowly, refusing to submit to the enemy's kindness. To him, every hamburger was an insult, a reminder that they had lost not only the war, but their identity. They want to make us soft, he hissed one morning. Don't you see? They want us to forget we are soldiers of the emperor. But even as he spoke, his voice trembled with weakness. His ribs jutted through his skin, his lips cracked. On the third week, he collapsed during morning inspection. The guards rushed to help, but Mori struck one away and shouted, "Don't touch me, devil!" And yet, when they carried him to the infirmary, it wasn't an American who fed him. It was Sato. He sat beside Mori's bed, holding a tray. On it was a hamburger, still steaming. "You can hate them," Sato said quietly. "But if you die here, it won't be by their bullets. It'll be by your pride." Mori glared at him. Then slowly he reached out a trembling hand and took the burger. For a long moment, he stared at it, tears forming. Then to everyone's astonishment, he whispered, "Forgive me, Father." He took a bite, and when the grease hit his tongue, something in him broke. He wept like a child. That night, a storm rolled over the desert, lightning splitting the black sky, thunder rumbling across the sand. Inside the barracks, men huddled together as rain pounded the roof. And through it all, one sound rose again, the faint fizz of a Coca-Cola bottle opening somewhere in the dark. "Someday," Sato whispered, "we will go home and tell them what we saw here. They won't believe us." The others nodded, because how could anyone believe it? That the enemy who burned their cities could feed them kindness? That the men who fought like demons could treat their captives like brothers? That a simple hamburger and a bottle of Coke could make soldiers cry harder than the sound of bombs? In war, hatred is easy, mercy is hard, but sometimes history turns not on the clash of armies, but on the taste of something that reminds men they are still human. As dawn rose again over Camp Florence, the smell of breakfast drifted across the desert. Warm bread, sizzling meat, and the bittersweet memory of a war that was ending. And for the first time since surrender, some of the Japanese POWs smiled. But deep inside the camp's command office, Captain Ellis stared at a telegram on his desk, one that would soon change everything. A message from Washington, and it began with 3 words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Atomic bomb successful. They had learned to trust their captors. Then came the morning when trust turned to ash. The telegram arrived before sunrise. It was stamped top secret and carried in the trembling hands of a young corporal who barely understood the weight of what he was delivering. Captain Raymond Ellis sat alone in his office, cigarette smoke curling toward the ceiling fan, the hum of the desert air still and heavy. He slid open the envelope and unfolded the message. It was only a few words typed in block letters. Reports confirmed, Hiroshima destroyed. New weapon, atomic bomb, successful. Ellis read it twice, then a third time. His hand began to tremble. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the paper like it had punched a hole through his chest. He whispered under his breath, "Good God, what have we done?" Outside, the camp stirred awake. Japanese prisoners lined up for roll call, the desert wind carrying the scent of breakfast, eggs, toast, and coffee. A few guards chatted idly about baseball scores and girlfriends back home, unaware that the world had just changed. When Sergeant Joe Parker entered Ellis's office, he found the captain still sitting in silence, staring at nothing. "Sir, you okay?" "Hiroshima," Ellis said softly. "They dropped it." "The new bomb?" Ellis nodded. "Flattened the whole city. Thousands dead. Maybe more." Joe froze. "Jesus." The two men stood there for a long moment, the sound of typewriters and birds outside feeling suddenly obscene. "What about the Japs?" Parker asked finally. "Do we tell them?" Ellis crushed out his cigarette, his jaw tight. "No, not yet. Let them eat breakfast in peace. One last time." By mid-morning, the radio in the command hut began crackling with updates. Reports spoke of a single bomb that leveled an entire city, of shadows burned into concrete walls, of firestorms that reached the sky. The words "unconditional surrender" began echoing across the airwaves. But word spreads like wildfire, even through fences and barbed wire. By noon, whispers had reached the prisoners. Some heard it from interpreters. Others caught snatches of conversation between guards. One phrase kept returning like an echo. "Hiroshima, gone." In Barracks 12, Sergeant Hiroshi Sato felt the chill before he understood the meaning. He sat with Kenta Yamazaki, polishing his worn boots. A pointless ritual, when a voice from the next bunk said shakily, "They destroyed our city with one bomb." Sato looked up. "What are you talking about?" "Hiroshima, a new weapon. Nothing left. Everyone dead." The words hit the air like shrapnel. At first, no one spoke. Then Kenta whispered, "My mother's family. They lived there." He stood slowly, the cloth slipping from his hand. His face was pale, his lips trembling. "No," Sato said softly. "It's propaganda. It has to be." But deep down, he knew it wasn't. That afternoon, tension thickened like smoke. The camp felt smaller, heavier. The sound of laughter vanished. Even the guards seemed nervous. When the bell rang for lunch, no one moved. Then Captain Ellis walked out to the assembly yard. He didn't wear his cap. His shirt was unbuttoned at the collar. His face was drawn. The prisoners gathered, hundreds of eyes watching him with silent suspicion. Some stood tall, defiant. Others trembled. The interpreter, a Japanese-American named Ken Tanaka, stood beside Ellis, translating every word. Ellis cleared his throat. His voice was steady, but heavy with something darker than authority. "Men of the Imperial Japanese Army," he began, "I have received news from Washington. A new kind of bomb has been used against your homeland, on the city of Hiroshima." A murmur rippled through the crowd like a wave. "The city is destroyed. The war may soon be over." Tanaka hesitated on the word destroyed, his voice cracking slightly as he spoke it in Japanese. The moment the words sank in, silence fell. Then came the first cry. It was a raw, animal sound. A man collapsing to his knees, clutching his head, screaming a name over and over. Another followed, then another. Within seconds, the yard was filled with sobbing, shouting, disbelief. Men tore at their uniforms. Some cursed the heavens. Others pounded the ground with their fists. Sato stood frozen, unable to breathe. He felt as though his insides were collapsing. The same Americans who had fed them, smiled at them, played baseball with them, had just vaporized their countrymen. "They gave us Coca-Cola," Kenta whispered, voice breaking, "and they burned my mother alive." Sato turned toward the guards on the perimeter. Their rifles gleamed under the sun. For the first time since his capture, he felt hatred rise again, deeper, colder than before. In the mess hall later that day, the food went untouched. The hamburgers that once brought tears of wonder now sat on plates, congealing. The prisoners stared at them like poison. Lieutenant Mori, who had once resisted eating American food, sat quietly at the corner table, his thin hands trembling. He stared at his meal and muttered, "They showed mercy to our bodies, but death to our souls." No one argued. That night, the guards patrolled nervously. The atmosphere was volatile, grief and anger mixing like gunpowder. Some POWs huddled in prayer, Others whispered revenge. A few simply lay awake, staring at the ceiling, hearing the sound of their city burning in their minds. At midnight, Sato slipped out of the barracks and walked toward the wire fence. The moon hung low, silver and ghostly over the desert. He pressed his hands against the cold metal, looking out at the vast emptiness beyond. "Why?" he whispered. "Why show us kindness just to destroy everything we loved?" Behind him, footsteps approached. It was Captain Ellis. He had no weapon, no guard escort, just his flashlight and the same haunted look from that morning. "Couldn't sleep either," he said quietly. Sato didn't turn. "You killed them," he said flatly. "All of them." "Not me," Ellis said softly. "Orders from men higher than I'll ever meet." "It doesn't matter," Sato replied. "You gave us food and now you've taken our world." The wind stirred between them. Ellis took a slow breath. "Listen, Sato. I fought your army. I saw what you did in Manila, Bataan, Nanking. I hated you for it. But now, after this," he shook his head, "I don't know what to feel anymore." "Do you regret it?" Sato asked. "Every damn minute," Ellis said. The two men stood in silence, soldier and prisoner, enemy and mirror. The barbed wire between them looked thinner than ever. Days passed. The official newspapers arrived. Black and white photos showed the ruins of Hiroshima, flattened streets, burned corpses, a city turned to dust. When the papers circulated through the camp, men broke down one by one. Some screamed. Others refused to believe it. Then came another telegram. "Nagasaki, second bomb, complete destruction." The last thread of illusion snapped. That evening, a riot almost broke out. Several prisoners began shouting at guards, throwing bowls, demanding vengeance. The Americans raised their rifles, unsure whether to fire. Ellis ran to the scene shouting, "Stand down, all of you!" The guards hesitated. The prisoners glared through tears and hatred. Finally, Sato stepped forward. He raised his hands. "Stop," he said in Japanese. "Enough blood. It's over." His voice broke through the noise like thunder. Slowly, the shouting subsided. Ellis looked at him, a man who had once refused to bow to anyone. Now, Sato stood between his men and death. That night in the officers' quarters, Ellis sat with Sergeant Parker, both staring into the darkness. "You think they'll ever forgive us?" Parker asked. Ellis sighed. "I don't even think we can forgive us." He poured 2 cups of black coffee, the only thing strong enough to silence the guilt clawing at him. "You know," Parker said after a long pause, "I saw one of them bury a hamburger today. Just dug a hole and put it in the dirt. Like a funeral." Ellis rubbed his temples. "They're mourning more than they're dead, Joe. They're mourning the lie we gave them, that we were better." At dawn, the prisoners were silent during roll call. No one looked up. The smell of breakfast drifted from the kitchens again. Bacon, eggs, bread. But the line stayed still. Sato stepped out slowly, holding something in his hand. It was a Coca-Cola bottle, the same one he had kept since his first day in the camp. He walked to the center of the yard, unscrewed the cap, and poured the dark liquid into the sand. "For Hiroshima," he said softly. Dozens of prisoners followed, holding their bottles high and emptying them in unison. The sound was eerie, 1,000 quiet, fizzing voices, like ghosts whispering through the desert wind. From his office, Captain Ellis watched, tears burning his eyes. "They cried when we gave it to them," he thought bitterly. "Now they cry as they give it back." War doesn't end when the guns go silent. Sometimes it ends when the enemy you tried to hate looks at you and sees himself. That night, the camp lights burned late. Letters were written but never sent. And in the morning, the American flag and the Japanese rising sun both hung half-mast, not for victory or defeat, but for the millions who would never taste peace again. When the emperor spoke, the world went silent, and in that silence, thousands of men broke. August 15, 1945. The desert was unbearably still. The morning sun hung low, painting the camp in golden dust. Inside the barracks, Japanese prisoners of war moved like ghosts, slow, deliberate, hollow. Word had spread through whispers before dawn. Japan had surrendered. At first, no one believed it. Some said it was American propaganda. Others said the emperor would never bow to mortals. But by mid-morning, even the guards looked different. quieter, heavier, as though history itself had exhaled. Then came the sound. The loudspeakers crackled across the camp yard, and for the first time, the voice of Emperor Hirohito reached them, faint, formal, trembling under the static. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. No one moved. Men froze mid-step, tools slipping from their hands. Even the guards stopped in their tracks. The interpreter, Ken Tanaka, stood near the radio with tears in his eyes, translating in a whisper as the emperor continued. To pave the way for a great peace for all generations to come, we have ordered our government to communicate to the allied nations our acceptance of their terms. A gasp rippled through the crowd. It was as if the desert itself had stopped breathing. Sergeant Hiroshi Sato stood near the fence, his hands trembling. For years he had lived by one unbreakable truth, that the emperor was divine, that surrender was worse than death. He had killed for that belief. He had starved for it. Now that belief had shattered. He sank to his knees. The emperor surrendered, he whispered. The son of heaven bowed? Kenta Yamazaki crouched beside him, his face pale. Maybe he had no choice. There's always a choice, Sato said bitterly. We chose death over surrender. And now, he looked at his hands, scarred, shaking, and realized he no longer knew what they were for. In the command office, Captain Raymond Ellis listened to the same broadcast, his hat resting on the desk beside him. He had expected relief, victory, celebration. Instead, all he felt was exhaustion. Sergeant Parker burst in. Sir, it's official. Japan surrendered. The war's over. Ellis didn't look up. Is it? Parker frowned. What do you mean? Tell that to the men out there. Half of them just found out they have no home to go back to. The other half don't know who they are anymore. He lit another cigarette. War doesn't end with words, Joe. It ends when the killing inside people stops. Outside, the camp had become a theater of silence. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers sat on the ground, motionless. Some stared at the sky. Others prayed. A few laughed hysterically, unable to process the truth. Then unexpectedly, a sound rose. Deep, broken, and terrible. Crying. Not the soft weeping of grief, but the raw, uncontrollable sobbing of men whose world had just collapsed. Lieutenant Kenji Mori, the once proud officer who had refused American food, stood apart from the others. His posture was stiff, but his eyes were red. We were raised to believe dying for the emperor was honor, he said hoarsely. Now he asks us to live for peace. How do you live after killing for honor? No one had an answer. That afternoon, the guards brought out loudspeakers again, this time playing American radio broadcasts celebrating victory. Patriotic songs filled the air, upbeat and triumphant. The contrast was unbearable. While the Americans cheered, the Japanese sat in silence. To one group, it was the end of horror. To the other, it was the death of identity. One guard, a boy from Ohio named Carter, looked out over the fence and whispered to his friend, "They look empty." "They are," his friend replied. "We took everything, their cities, their families, their gods." That evening, the prisoners were gathered for roll call. The sky was streaked with orange and violet, the desert wind carrying the smell of dust and distant rain. Captain Ellis stood before them, reading from a prepared statement. The war between the United States and Japan has officially ended. You are no longer enemies. You are now prisoners awaiting repatriation. The translator spoke the words and the reaction was surreal. Silence, then murmurs, then confusion. One man fell to his knees, laughing uncontrollably. Another whispered, "Repatriation. To what home?" Then Ellis said something not written in his notes. "You fought bravely for your country. So did we. But maybe now it's time we both start fighting for peace." It was simple, almost naive. But something in his voice made the men look up. For the first time, the Americans weren't soldiers, and the Japanese weren't prisoners. They were just men trying to make sense of survival. That night, in the barracks, conversations returned. Cautious, uncertain, but human. Kenta sat on his cot, writing a letter to no one. "To my mother," he wrote, I hope you didn't suffer. They say Hiroshima is gone, but I will find you when I return. If not in this life, then in the next." Beside him, Sato stared at the half-empty Coca-Cola bottle he'd once poured out. He turned it slowly in his hands, the glass glinting in the lamplight. "Do you think they'll let us go home?" Kenta asked. "Home," Sato murmured, "if it still exists." The next morning, the camp gates opened, not for release, but for something else entirely. Celebration. American soldiers set up loudspeakers, flags, and barrels of beer. They danced, sang, and shouted, the desert echoing with the sound of victory. The Japanese prisoners watched from behind the fence, silent spectators to someone else's joy. Then unexpectedly, a young guard approached the gate holding a tray of hamburgers. "You guys hungry?" he asked awkwardly. "Peace offering." The same food that had once brought tears of gratitude now felt like betrayal. But hunger and exhaustion won again. One by one, the POWs accepted the burgers, not as gifts, but as symbols of survival. Sato took one, hesitated, then bit into it. The same taste, smoky, salty, strange, filled his mouth. But this time it didn't bring tears. It brought memory. He remembered the day he was captured, the jungle, the blood, the screaming. He remembered the friend who took his own life rather than surrender. And now here he was, alive, eating his enemy's food, his emperor defeated. He chewed slowly, swallowed, and whispered, "So this is peace." That night, Captain Ellis walked through the quiet camp one last time. He stopped at the fence where he had once spoken with Sato. The desert wind was cooler now. "It's over," he said softly. Sato, sitting nearby, looked up. "Is it?" Ellis smiled faintly. "For me, maybe not. But for you, I hope so." Sato nodded. "I used to think honor was dying for the emperor. Now I think it's living long enough to understand why." They stood in silence for a while, the stars above them brighter than they'd ever been. When the war ended, not everyone celebrated. For some, peace was a stranger harder to face than any enemy. But in that strange desert, among barbed wire and hamburgers, enemies began to remember what it meant to be human. As the sun rose the next day, the American and Japanese flags fluttered side by side in the soft breeze. Not in rivalry, but in quiet surrender to the idea that mercy, however painful, is the only victory that lasts. By September 1945, the desert heat had softened. The sharp winds of Arizona carried a strange calm over Camp Florence. A calm no one quite trusted. The war was over, but its ghost lingered everywhere. In the quiet between shifts, in the eyes of soldiers and prisoners alike, the silence of peace was often louder than gunfire. The Americans had orders. Keep the POWs until repatriation could be arranged. But with ships full of wounded returning from the Pacific, it would take months before the prisoners could go home. Months of waiting, months of reflection, months of living beside those who were once sworn enemies. And in that waiting, something unexpected began to grow. It started with a baseball. One afternoon, an American soldier hit a foul ball over the fence. It rolled into the prisoner's compound, coming to rest at the feet of Sergeant Hiroshi Sato. He picked it up, turning it over in his hands. The stitches, the leather, foreign yet oddly familiar. A group of POWs gathered, whispering. Across the fence, a young guard named Carter grinned. "Hey, that's our ball," he called. Sato looked up, hesitated, then tossed it back. A perfect, clean throw. The Americans cheered. Carter laughed. "Nice arm, buddy. You play?" The question lingered. Sato didn't answer, but that night he couldn't stop thinking about it. 2 days later, the guards found something astonishing. A small group of Japanese prisoners had made a bat out of scrap wood and a ball out of tightly rolled rags. They were tossing it around, laughing quietly. The Americans stopped to watch. Then one guard, the same Carter, smiled and said, "What the hell? Let's play." That afternoon, the fences didn't matter. Americans on one side, Japanese on the other, a single ball arcing through the desert air between them. Laughter echoed across the sand, rough, uncertain, but real. It was the first sound of life the camp had heard in months. Not all healing came through games. In the far corner of the camp, near the laundry huts, A patch of earth had been left dry and forgotten. One morning, Sato and a few others began digging, not for escape, but for something else. When Ellis walked by later that day, he stopped in surprise. "What are they doing?" he asked Parker. "Looks like planting," Parker said, scratching his head. "In the desert?" Indeed, the prisoners were planting, seeds smuggled from their rations, beans, onions, anything that might grow. They worked silently, their hands calloused, their faces calm. When Ellis asked Sato what it was for, the man answered simply, "Life. Even here, life." By October, the first shoots broke through the soil, fragile green lines pushing up from the red earth. The guards began bringing water from the kitchen to help. Soon, a small garden grew behind the barracks, Japanese vegetables in American soil. It became a symbol in the camp, proof that life could rise even from defeat. But peace, even in small doses, was fragile. One morning, Kenta Yamazaki received a letter, the first mail delivered since surrender. The envelope was crumpled, the writing faint. It had come through the Red Cross. He opened it with trembling hands. Inside were 3 lines, written in his sister's handwriting. "Kenta, Hiroshima is gone. Mother and father did not survive. Come home when you can. Aiko." He stared at the paper for a long time. Then he folded it carefully, placed it against his chest, and walked straight to the mess hall. There on the counter was a Coca-Cola bottle. He picked it up, opened it, and took a single sip. Then he whispered, "For them." He handed the bottle to the American cook behind the counter. "Thank you," he said softly. The cook, not knowing what to say, just nodded. That night, Kenta sat under the stars and cried silently, not from pain, but from the strange relief of still being alive when everyone he loved was gone. A week later, Captain Ellis called a meeting of guards. "Washington's sending inspectors," he said. "They want to see how we're treating the prisoners. Keep everything clean, orderly." Parker smirked. "We could show them the garden." "Yeah," Ellis said. "We could." When the inspectors came, they were stunned. They saw prisoners tending vegetables, drawing portraits, even carving small wooden toys for local children. One prisoner, a former artist from Osaka, had painted a mural on the side of a barrack, a mountain landscape with cherry blossoms and the words, "Even the wind has mercy." The lead inspector turned to Ellis. "You've built something remarkable here, Captain. How'd you do it?" Ellis looked out at the prisoners working under the sun. "I didn't," he said quietly. "They did." Before the inspectors left, Sato approached them carrying a small wooden box. Inside was a carved figure, a bridge over a river, delicate and precise. "From the men of Japan," he said, bowing slightly. "A gift for peace." The inspector took it, visibly moved. When Ellis saw it later, he smiled faintly. "A bridge," he murmured. "That's what this place became." By late November, something extraordinary happened. Thanksgiving, an American holiday none of the Japanese understood, approached. The officers planned a modest dinner for the guards, but Ellis had another idea. He gathered his men. "This year," he said, "we're eating with them." The room fell silent. "With the prisoners?" Parker asked. "That's right. Same tables, same food." The next day, long wooden tables were set up in the open yard, turkeys roasted in makeshift ovens, potatoes, bread, pies. The smell was irresistible. When the time came, the Japanese POWs filed out cautiously. They hesitated at first, but Ellis stepped forward, raising a glass. "To peace," he said simply. Sato nodded. "To life," he replied. And for the first time in history, men who had fought on opposite sides of the world sat together, eating, laughing, sharing stories through broken language and gestures. Some guards showed photos of their families. Some POWs drew pictures of their homes. And as the sun dipped below the desert horizon, the air was filled with a quiet warmth no one expected to feel again. Kenta looked at his empty plate, smiled faintly, and whispered, "If my mother could see this, she would not believe it." Sato nodded. "Neither would mine." Later that night, as the camp fell asleep, Captain Ellis walked through the rows of tables now empty but still smelling of food and peace. He found something on one of the benches, A small origami crane folded from a page of a Japanese Bible. On one wing, written in careful English, were the words, "Forgive so we can live." Ellis held it in his hand for a long time. He knew then that something extraordinary had happened, not between nations, but between souls. In war, bridges are burned faster than they can be built, but sometimes in forgotten places far from the front lines, men remember how to build again, not with steel or treaties, but with kindness. As the stars shimmered over the Arizona desert that night, the camp slept in peace for the first time. A fragile peace born not from surrender, but from shared humanity. The wind came early that morning, cold and restless, sweeping across the Arizona desert like a whisper from another world. It rattled the tin roofs, bent the dry grass, and carried with it a scent of rain that never came. The camp was awake before sunrise. There was movement everywhere, trunks being packed, uniforms straightened, letters folded one last time. After months of waiting, the Japanese prisoners were finally going home, or so they were told. The announcement had come the night before. Captain Ellis had gathered them all in the yard, his voice steady but eyes uncertain. "Your repatriation orders have been approved," he said. "Trains will take you to San Francisco. From there, ships to Japan." The words hung in the air like a promise no one dared to believe. For many of them, Japan existed only in memory, a country that might no longer resemble the home they had left behind. Sergeant Hiroshi Sato had barely slept. He sat on the edge of his cot, hands folded around his old Coca-Cola bottle, now empty and clouded from months of being held. He had kept it not as a token of captivity, but as proof that the enemy could be human. Beside him, Kenta folded a small bundle of letters, ones he had written but never mailed, letters to a family that no longer existed. "Do you think we'll recognize it?" Kenta asked quietly. "Japan." Sato looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Maybe not with our eyes, but maybe with our hearts." Kenta nodded, but his eyes were wet. "I don't think my heart remembers." The guards moved among the barracks, checking names, marking lists. Most of them were young, boys who had never seen combat, who had come to know the prisoners not as enemies but as men with stories, faces, and laughter. Carter, the guard who once tossed a baseball over the fence, stopped by Sato's bunk. "So this is it," Carter said. "You heading home?" Sato smiled faintly. "Home," he repeated. "I hope it's still there." Carter reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded photograph. "This was my brother," he said softly. "He died in Okinawa." Sato's smile faded. He bowed his head. "I am sorry." Carter nodded slowly. "I was supposed to hate you," he said, "but I guess I just don't anymore." Sato's voice was quiet. "Then maybe we both won something." Outside, Captain Ellis stood by the gate, smoking as the first buses pulled in. He had spent weeks preparing for this moment, but now that it was here, he felt strangely hollow. Parker joined him, holding a clipboard. "You look like a man losing his best friends," Parker said with a small grin. Ellis exhaled a long plume of smoke. "Maybe I am," he murmured. "You spend enough time fighting monsters, Joe. You start to forget what men look like. And then one day the monsters turn human again, and you don't know what to do with that." The buses were simple and gray, engines humming softly in the cool dawn. The prisoners lined up in rows carrying what little they had. A few clothes, a sketchbook, a letter, a photograph. Some clutched gifts from the Americans. Small crosses, harmonicas, even a baseball signed by the guards. When Sato stepped forward, he stopped and looked back at the camp one last time. The watchtower, the garden, the barbed wire. All of it looked smaller now, almost fragile. Kenta whispered, "Strange. The place that caged us feels like the only place we were ever free." Sato nodded slowly, "Because here, we remembered how to live." Ellis walked over to them, hands behind his back. "Sato," he said, his voice heavy with something unspoken. "You were a good soldier, but you're a better man now. Don't forget that." Sato bowed deeply. "You showed us something we did not expect to find here, Captain. Mercy." Ellis shook his head. "No. You gave it back." For a moment, neither man spoke. The wind pressed against their uniforms, carrying the sound of the American flag flapping overhead. Ellis reached into his pocket and handed Sato something, a folded piece of paper. "This was found in the office after the inspectors left," he said. "Thought you should have it." Sato unfolded it. It was the small origami crane with the words, "Forgive so we can live." He looked up at Ellis. "Did you write this?" Ellis smiled faintly. "No, one of your men did, but I think it belongs to all of us now." When the order came, the line began to move. The prisoners climbed aboard the buses one by one, each taking a last look at the camp. Some waved to the guards, some bowed. A few touched the ground before stepping away, as though saying farewell to the soil that had changed them. Kenta was the last to board. He turned to Ellis. "If I ever have a son," he said, "I will tell him about the American who gave a prisoner his freedom before his country did." Ellis's throat tightened. "And if I ever have one," he replied, "I'll tell him about the enemy who taught me to be human again." The buses rolled out slowly, kicking up clouds of dust. The sound of engines faded into the desert distance until all that remained was silence. The guards stood quietly, hats in hand. Ellis watched until the last bus disappeared over the horizon. For a long time he didn't move. In the empty camp, the wind whispered through the wires, and the abandoned garden rustled softly. A few green leaves trembled, stubborn against the dry earth. Parker came up beside him. "You think they'll be okay?" he asked. Ellis didn't answer for a while. Then he said, "No one comes out of a war okay, but maybe they'll come out of it human." He looked toward the horizon where the buses had gone and whispered, "Maybe that's enough." That night, Ellis walked alone through the deserted barracks. The walls still carried faint marks. Japanese characters scratched into the wood, small prayers, names, dates. He stopped by one cot and found a small wooden carving left behind. It was the same bridge figure the prisoners had once given the inspectors, only smaller. On its base, someone had etched two words in rough English. "Thank you." He sat down on the edge of the cot, holding the carving in his hands. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to weep. Not from guilt or grief, but from the unbearable beauty of forgiveness. Outside, thunder rolled faintly over the desert, a rare sound in that land of heat and silence. It sounded almost like applause from heaven. The next morning, when the sun rose, the camp stood empty, bathed in gold light. The flag still waved, but the wind felt different, lighter, freer. And in the far corner of the camp, the garden bloomed. Its small green plants pushing through the soil as if to remind the world that life always finds a way. The war was over, but the lesson it left behind would outlive every soldier who fought it. They had come as enemies, lived as captives, and left as men who understood the simplest truth, that kindness, even between the unlikeliest of hearts, can survive anything, even war. The ship from San Francisco cut through the Pacific like a slow heartbeat, the water gray and endless. On deck, the former prisoners stood shoulder to shoulder, silent, watching the horizon appear. It had been months since they left the Arizona desert, and yet for many that strange land of sand and hamburgers felt more real than the home they were returning to. Japan waited ahead, wounded, unrecognizable, silent. Sato stood near the railing, the wind tugging at his thin jacket. In his hands, he held the small origami crane Captain Ellis had given him. The edges were worn now, the paper soft from being opened and refolded too many times. Beside him, Kenta leaned against the rail, staring into the fog. "Do you think they'll accept us?" Kenta asked. Sato looked at him. "We fought, we surrendered, and we survived. I don't know if that's something to forgive or something to explain." Kenta smiled faintly. "Maybe both." The ship docked at Yokohama on a cold December morning. The harbor was a skeleton of what it once was. Cranes rusted, ships half sunk, the smell of smoke and salt mingling in the air. As they disembarked, the men walked down the ramp in silence, their eyes wide, their steps cautious. The first thing they saw was the rubble. The second was the people. Women in torn kimonos, children barefoot in the ash, men with hollow eyes and empty hands. The cities they had once sworn to defend were now nothing more than fields of ghosts. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Tokyo, each name whispered like a wound. Kenta clutched his small bundle of letters tightly. He walked through the ruined streets of Hiroshima 2 days later, tracing paths that no longer existed. There were no houses, no shrines, no familiar faces, only silence. He knelt among the ruins and pressed the letters into the ground, whispering, "I came home, Mother. I came home." Sato found him there, standing among the rubble as snow began to fall. He said nothing, only placed a hand on Kenta's shoulder. The two men stood together, soldiers without armies, survivors without homes. Later that night, they sat beside a small fire made from broken wood and fragments of memory. Around them, a few other returning soldiers gathered. No one spoke at first. Then one man, a young officer, and asked softly, "What were they like? The Americans?" Sato stared into the flames for a long moment before answering. "They were men, just men. Some cruel, some kind, some both. They gave us food when we expected death. They destroyed our cities, but they showed us mercy. I don't understand it, but I think maybe that's the point. War teaches you to hate. Peace teaches you to wonder." The others listened in silence. Kenta poked at the fire and said quietly, "They gave us hamburgers and Coca-Cola. We cried." The men laughed softly, the sound fragile but real. It felt good to laugh again. Over the following months, the returning prisoners scattered across Japan. Some returned to families, some to graves, and some to nothing at all. Sato went north to Kyoto, where his sister's house still stood, half burned but standing. He rebuilt it by hand, plank by plank, with the same patience he had once used to tend the garden in the camp. He hung the paper crane above the doorway, its wings faded but still intact. Every morning he walked to the river, poured a small cup of water into the current, and whispered a prayer, not for victory, but for forgiveness. Kenta found work at a rebuilding site in Hiroshima. One afternoon, as he helped lift timber into place, a little boy came by selling bottles of an unfamiliar drink. The label was written in English, Coca-Cola. Kenta stared at it for a long time, then bought one. He twisted the cap and took a sip. The fizz burned his throat and his memory all at once. He smiled through tears. "For them," he whispered. Years passed. Japan rose again, city by city, life by life. And somewhere in Arizona, Captain Ellis grew old. He retired, kept a farm, and sometimes told his grandchildren stories about a camp where enemies had learned to be friends. On his mantel sat a small wooden carving of a bridge, dusted but never forgotten. When he died, a letter was found among his things. It was addressed to no one in particular. "If anyone finds this, know that war never made me proud. What did was the day a man I once called enemy showed me mercy. We all live because someone, somewhere, chose not to hate." In Kyoto, decades later, Sato read about Ellis's death in a newspaper clipping sent by the U.S. Embassy. He sat quietly for a long time, then took the paper crane from above his doorway and set it afloat on the river. The current carried it away, spinning gently under the morning sun. As it disappeared downstream, Sato whispered, "Thank you, Captain." He watched it vanish, and for the first time, the war truly felt over. Not because one side won or lost, but because one man had forgiven another. The wind blew softly through the trees. The sound was almost like laughter, faint, distant, eternal. And somewhere in that sound, if you listened closely, you could almost hear it again. The faint fizz of a Coca-Cola bottle opening in the desert, the first taste of peace after years of war, the memory of enemies rediscovering what it meant to be human. In war, men fight for flags. In peace, they live for moments. Sometimes the smallest kindness, a meal, a drink, a word, can heal what nations could not. Remember that mercy is not weakness. It is strength greater than any army. If you were moved by this story, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications, so you never miss more powerful, emotional stories from history that remind us how humanity can rise even from the ashes of war.